In 2010, 10 children climbed onto a school bus for a field trip. They never came back. No calls, no screams, no struggle, just an empty vehicle found with its doors wide open deep in the woods. For 7 weeks, search teams scoured every inch of Pine Haven Reserve. And just when the world began to forget them, a child's backpack was found high in a tree, swaying in the wind like it had been watching us all along. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your town or your own life. Every click helps keep these voices from fading. My name's Marlene Whitaker. I was 47 back then, working the front office at Brook Hollow School, an old red brick K-5 tucked at the edge of a small town in western Massachusetts. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the mailman still waved and parents left their car engines running at drop-off because nobody worried about theft or trouble. I'd worked there for 15 years. My own kids had passed through its halls. We had butterfly gardens, PTA pancake breakfasts, and a hallway lined with handprints from every graduating kindergarten class. Safety wasn't just a word, it was baked into everything we did. That spring, the Buttercup class was gearing up for their annual Nature Day. 10 little ones, all between 4 and 5. I knew every one of them by name: Ellie, Nathan, Ava, Mateo. Their voices echoed down the hall each morning, full of questions and juice box chatter. Their teacher, Ms. Ruth Connolly, was the kind of person parents trusted, instantly organized. Gentle always had a song ready when a child cried. And Mr. Draper, our soft-spoken science teacher, had led dozens of these field trips to Pine Haven Reserve over the years. Knew the place like the back of his hand. The morning of May 4th started like any other. Ms. Connolly was out front with her clipboard, her long braid tucked under a sun hat. Mr. Draper loaded up a crate of magnifying glasses and trail maps, and Dina Morales, one of the moms, had offered to chaperone. Her daughter Anna clung to her leg in line, shy but grinning. I checked the weather that day. 66 degrees and breezy. Perfect. I remember standing by the office window as the little yellow bus pulled out of the lot, turning left toward the woods. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time anyone at Brook Hollow saw them. The first half of the day passed like usual. Lunch deliveries, a scraped knee in the third-grade hallway, a staff meeting about printer toner. But around 3, I got a call from one of the parents, Caleb's mom, asking if the field trip had run late. Her husband was waiting in the pickup line. The bus wasn't back yet. That wasn't alarming at first. Maybe traffic. Maybe they stayed for an extra story by the creek. But by 3:20, 3 more parents called. At 3:40, I tried both Ms. Connolly's and Mr. Draper's phones. Straight to voicemail. When Principal Haley stepped into the office and asked if I'd heard from the field group, her voice was tight, but she was still calm. She told me to call the preserve's ranger station. I remember the sound of my fingers on the keypad too loud against the office quiet. Then came the moment. The one that shifted the ground under my feet. The ranger on duty said no school group had checked back out. The last signature in the trail book was Brook Hollow School Buttercup class, logged at 9:56 a.m. Nothing after that, just a line of ink, and then nothing. The ranger's voice didn't change when he told me they hadn't signed out. That's what got me. No urgency, no alarm, just a quiet fact on the other end of the line. The Buttercup class had checked in at 9:56 that morning, but there was no second entry, no exit. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the phone in my hand like it might ring again and undo what he'd just said. When I told Principal Haley, she pressed her lips together and walked out of the office without a word. 2 minutes later, she was back with her coat and her keys and told me to call local law enforcement right away. That was at 4:10 p.m. By 4:45, a ranger had reached the Willow Loop trailhead. He radioed back that the school bus was still parked in the gravel lot. Doors open, empty. No sign of the kids, the teachers, or the volunteer parent. The lunch cooler was inside half unzipped. A few tiny socks were rolled up in the corner seat. Everything else was gone. The ranger followed the path to the first fork. Nothing. He checked the picnic area near the creek. Still nothing. That's when the sheriff's department was called in. And by the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, the trail was flooded with deputies, paramedics, and a full search and rescue crew from the next county over. The first thing they did was seal off the preserve. Anyone still in the woods was escorted out. A line of yellow tape went up across the entrance road. Reporters hadn't arrived yet. Neither had the helicopters. It was still just us, the staff, the parents standing in small knots outside the school, clutching phones that didn't ring, blinking hard when a car pulled in, hoping it was them. That night, the air turned cold fast. It always did in May. I remember watching the searchlights sweep back and forth across the trees while they brought in the first team of dogs. They followed the trail about 2 miles in before freezing up, whining low, and refusing to go any further. That was the first hour. After that, it all blurred together. Deputies with thermal scopes. Volunteers combing the woods in pairs, calling out names until their voices cracked. A firefighter slipping and twisting his ankle near the ravine. Nothing found. No footprints, no clothing, not even a dropped toy or juice box. And the silence, it wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. You could hear boots crunching over leaves, but not much else. No wind. No birds. Even the insects had gone still. One of the older deputies, a man who'd done this for 30 years, said later it was the eeriest search he'd ever worked. He said it felt like the forest was holding its breath. Back at the school, the pickup lane was still full. Some of the parents refused to leave even after the second notice went out. Ms. Haley and I stayed until nearly midnight, calling every number we had, printing out class rosters, and preparing statements for the news crews that would surely be there by morning. I kept hoping it was all a miscommunication, that they'd gone off trail and gotten turned around, that someone had found them and taken them to a ranger post we didn't know about. But as the hours dragged on and no group came walking out of those trees, that hope began to thin out into something colder. By morning, the entire perimeter had been mapped out. Every marked trail, every offshoot, every cave crevice and riverbank within a 5-mile radius. The first chopper went up just after sunrise. Dogs came from 2 counties over. Drones were deployed. The command center set up a folding table and a whiteboard under a green tarp where they tracked areas covered and coordinates flagged for follow-up. The parents were moved to a conference room inside the school and told not to speak to reporters. That second day, around late afternoon, one of the volunteers found something barely visible stuck in a low bush near the edge of the western trail. A piece of paper folded and damp. It looked like a child's drawing. Smiling stick figures, a sun with big yellow rays, a bird. At first we thought it was a coincidence. Maybe it had blown in from another group. But then they found another, and another. Each one spaced just far enough apart to make a trail. The drawings were simple, done in crayon. Most were happy scenes. Kids holding hands. A red tree. But some were stranger. A black circle. A jagged shape that didn't look like anything from nature. They followed the trail until it disappeared near the ravine. No footprints, no signs of movement beyond that point. Just a blank patch of forest where the trail went cold. By day 3, the FBI was involved. Search teams grew in number, but their optimism had faded. That was when they found the first physical object, Ms. Connolly's backpack. It was sitting near the base of a slope, resting on top of a patch of moss, like it had been placed there carefully. Not tossed, not dragged, just set down. Inside were a juice box, her broken glasses, and the laminated roll call sheet she always carried on field trips. Most of the names had been smudged by moisture. Only a few were still readable. There were no bloodstains, no torn fabric, no clear sign of panic or struggle. Just the bag waiting. What unnerved the officers the most wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't. There were no signs of exit, no return tracks, no adult-sized prints, no tire marks from another vehicle. And from what the preservation team could tell, the trail they'd taken Willow Loop should have brought them right back to the parking lot in under 2 hours. That was the entire plan. But something had gone wrong. And whatever it was, it left behind no trace but silence. That night, the theories began. First, it was an accident. Maybe they'd gotten lost and were still out there. Then the idea of a mass abduction began to surface. Some even wondered if the group had fallen into one of the old wells rumored to dot the area. The forest had layers of history, some of it never mapped. Underground tunnels, forgotten cave systems. One ranger mentioned a mining claim from the 1800s that had never been verified. It was possible, they said. But if that were the case, why no screams? Why no sound at all? I don't remember when I first heard someone use the word taken, but I remember how it felt, like a shift in temperature, a door closing in your chest. Most people didn't want to believe it. They clung to the idea of rescue for days, even weeks. But the forest never gave back what it took. It would be 7 weeks before we got another sign. And when it came, it didn't answer anything. If anything, it deepened the mystery, because the first thing they found wasn't a child. It was a backpack, pink, torn, hanging 30 feet up in a tree, swaying softly where no child could have ever climbed. The name tag was still attached, Ellie Ramirez printed in permanent marker, and at the base of the tree, arranged in a perfect arc, 7 pairs of tiny shoes all lined up like someone had placed them there to be seen. The shoes were clean. That was the part I couldn't shake. 7 tiny pairs all lined up beneath that tree like someone had set them there for a reason. No dirt, no pine needles, just soles turned outward and laces neatly tied. We didn't know whose they were at first. No names, no tags, but the sizes told us enough. Ellie's name was still on the backpack up in the branches, but there were 10 children on that trip. 7 pairs of shoes meant 3 were missing, or spared. Or maybe it meant nothing at all. Nobody said it out loud, but we all saw it. 7 shoes, not 10. The clearing where they were found was off-trail deeper into the woods than the kids should have gone. You wouldn't end up there by accident, not with a guide like Mr. Draper. There was no footpath, no markers, and the forest got denser the closer you got. I remember one of the deputies saying it felt like the whole place had shifted around them, like the terrain didn't match the maps anymore. They brought in another drone team that week, this one with better thermal imaging, longer flight time, but the scans turned up nothing. No signs of movement, no heat signatures, just a canopy of branches and cold ground. People started talking then. Not just the families, but everyone. Teachers, board members, the older folks who'd lived near Pine Haven their whole lives. One of the school janitors told me he remembered a case from the 70s, 2 teenagers who went missing in the same reserve. Supposedly found days later wandering barefoot with no memory of how they got there. The records didn't say much, just disoriented and exposure. And maybe it had nothing to do with this. But when 10 children disappear without a sound, people start reaching for anything that might fit. The official line from the sheriff's office didn't change. They called it an active, ongoing search, but the tone shifted. You could hear it in their voices during press briefings. Hope drained out of them, replaced by a sort of clinical distance. They reviewed known persons of interest. They re-interviewed anyone who'd worked at the school in the last 5 years. They ran background checks on all parents and volunteers, including Dina Morales. Nothing turned up. Not a custody dispute, not a disciplinary issue, not a red flag in any direction. It wasn't just that they didn't have a suspect. They didn't have a single working theory that held water for more than a day. Still, people tried to help. One of the middle school teachers, Mr. Canley, I think, set up a community database to track search progress and sightings. Volunteers used it to mark off sections of trail they'd walked, items, recovered times, and dates. For a while, it helped folks feel like they were contributing. But then entries started popping up that didn't make sense. Reports of children seen near the highway. A woman claimed she heard singing in the woods around 3 a.m. Another swore she saw movement behind her barn on the edge of the preserve, small figures moving in pairs. Each one was dismissed after investigation. No footprints, no evidence, just stories. I think the worst part came about 3 weeks in when rumors began to turn inward. People started pointing fingers. Not strangers anymore, friends, neighbors, even family. Someone leaked that Mr. Draper had left the group briefly during the hike, that he'd gone ahead to check a trail marker while Ms. Connolly stayed with the children. The time he was gone changed with every retelling. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Then came the whispers that he hadn't wanted to go on this trip, that he'd been distracted in the days before, that he'd asked for the loop trail specifically even though another route had better visibility. When I heard that last one, I remember sitting back in my chair at the front desk and just staring at the framed photo of the Buttercup class still hanging near the copier. 10 little faces smiling, dressed like bees for spring play. I'd helped cut out the wings. I couldn't picture Louis Draper hurting any of them. But I also couldn't say for sure what he was thinking that day. No one could. Ms. Connolly's family stayed quiet through most of it. Her younger sister came by the school once to pick up a few of her things. She didn't speak much, just packed the box, left the roll of masking tape behind, and walked out without saying goodbye. Dina Morales gave 2 interviews early on, both short, both carefully worded. She said she'd stepped away to help her daughter with a scraped knee, that when she looked back up, Ms. Connolly was laughing with the children near the creek, and Mr. Draper had already gone ahead. When she turned around again, they were gone. All of them. By week 4, the national media had moved on. A celebrity trial, a tornado out west, there was always something else to fill the airwaves. But in town, the story never left. People kept their porch lights on, left toys at the edge of the woods. The grocery store started printing missing posters on the backs of receipts. And still not a single person, not one, reported hearing a scream. You'd think 10 kids disappearing would leave behind chaos. Torn branches, drag marks, something. But it was the opposite. The ground stayed smooth. The birds stayed quiet. The only sign of movement came one morning when a neighbor's trail cam caught a strange flicker of motion at the preserve's southern border, just before dawn. No shape, no clear figure, just a distortion, enough to raise questions but not answer any. Around that same time, someone started leaving drawings near the school gates. Slipped under the chain-link fence at night. Same crayon colors, same sun and trees and stick figures. Most were generic, but 2 of them showed something different. A circle of shoes beneath a tree, a backpack hanging in the branches. Someone had either seen the clearing or had been there. That week, the sheriff's office upped patrols and added new security cameras around the school. Not because they expected the children to return, but because no one could explain who was leaving those pictures. Whoever it was, they never got caught. Never left prints. Never triggered a motion light. Just paper folded in half, left flat on the asphalt like a note that didn't want to be read out loud. By the end of May, the search command tent was scaled back. The whiteboard taken down. Volunteers sent home. I remember standing by the office window again, watching them load up the last of the equipment. I counted each van as it pulled away, thinking about the bus that never came back. Thinking about the roll call sheet, the laminated one with 10 names and only 7 pairs of shoes. And then one morning, just before the last search drone went up, a ranger found something buried near the base of a ridge. It wasn't new. It had been there a while, covered in leaves and soil and time. It was a scrap of cloth, bright yellow, the kind of fabric used for the field trip vests we kept in the supply closet. And on the corner, stitched in black thread, was the name of a boy from the Buttercup class. A name we hadn't spoken in a few days. Not because we'd forgotten, but because we didn't know how to say it anymore. Not without wondering who was still listening. I don't remember how long I stared at that scrap of fabric before picking it up. It was small, just a corner frayed at the edges, stiff with dampness and age. Bright yellow still holding color through the dirt. The kind of vest we used to send kids out in when they took field trips near traffic or crowded areas. It had been part of a set 20 or so folded neatly in a labeled bin. We'd used them on park days, nature walks, even fire drills. I turned it over in my hands, and there it was, black thread stitched carefully across the inside hem. Tommy DeLeon. He was one of the younger ones, only 4. I remembered his mother dropping him off that morning, crouching beside him to adjust the straps on his backpack, whispering something that made him laugh. And now here was his name folded in half under a ridge of wet soil halfway up a forest slope that wasn't even supposed to be part of the trail. When I handed it over to the sheriff's team, they logged it as physical evidence but didn't say much else. They'd stopped offering comfort by then. Everything was just procedure. Measured, recorded, filed. But I could feel it rattled them. Something about the location, the elevation, the way the soil had settled around it. One of the search techs later told me it wasn't a place a child would have wandered to on their own. Too steep, too far off course, too well hidden. That word hidden stuck with me for days. After that, the leads went cold again. We stopped getting daily updates. The task force meetings moved to bi-weekly. One of the officers, Deputy Lang, started sitting out. Said he needed to focus on other assignments. No one blamed him. You could see it wearing on all of them. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became. Teachers stopped asking questions in the break room. Parents stopped showing up at the school board meetings. Even the front lawn memorials started to fade, balloons deflating candles washed out by rain paper signs curled up at the corners. I kept replacing the batteries in the motion lights by the south gate, even though nobody walked past them anymore. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. At home, I started leaving the TV on at night just for the sound. I wasn't sleeping much. My daughter had left for college the year before, and now I found myself staring at her old bedroom like it might vanish too if I looked away long enough. I wasn't the only one. Parents of the Buttercup kids stopped making eye contact at the grocery store. Some didn't come into town at all. We heard one family had moved to Ohio. Another went down to Florida to stay with relatives. Some folks understood. Others called it abandonment. I didn't have the energy to argue either way. That was around the time the rumors changed. At first, people blamed the preserve the terrain, the idea of something accidental. Then it shifted to strangers' vans, drifters, the idea of something orchestrated. But now the suspicion turned inward. Not at the teachers anymore, but at the woods themselves. There were stories passed along in quiet corners of church parking lots and late-night coffee booths. A park ranger who said he'd heard music in the trees once years ago, long before this. An older woman who swore she'd lost time in that forest during a hike back in '82 claimed her watch skipped an hour that the sun dropped too fast. There was a couple who said they used to camp there every fall until they woke one morning to find their tent zipped open and all their matches rearranged in a perfect circle around the fire pit. No one filed reports. Nothing made it into the newspapers. But the stories kept circling. I started reading more about the land. Not the preserve, but what was underneath it. Old records from before Pinehaven was protected. Geological surveys, land grants, handwritten letters. Turns out there had once been a quarry operation about 5 miles south, shut down in the early 1900s. Some of the shafts had been sealed, but others were simply abandoned. I found one archived map that showed a narrow tunnel labeled Maintenance Access Only. It ended just short of the modern boundary line for the reserve. I printed it out and circled the spot in red ink, not because I knew what it meant, but because it was the first thing that felt like a thread. When I brought the map to the sheriff's office, the deputy at the front desk just nodded and said they'd take it into consideration. I could tell he'd heard 100 theories already. But later that week, I noticed a crew of 3 unmarked SUVs parked near the old fire road that ran behind the preserve. No badges, no press. Just men in canvas jackets unloading gear and moving quietly through the trees. I watched from my car for over an hour. When I finally drove away, I saw one of them glance over his shoulder in my direction. Not unfriendly, just alert. The following Monday, we got word that the search had shifted underground. Nothing public, just a memo to school staff saying new geological scans were underway. They'd found something. A void, they called it. That was the word. Not a tunnel, not a cave, a void. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. For the first time in weeks, people started to talk again. Carefully. Quietly. Not with hope exactly, but with attention. We all felt it. Like something had moved beneath our feet. That night, someone lit candles across the whole sidewalk in front of the school. No one claimed credit, but the flames stayed burning till morning. It was 3 days later when I saw the file again. An old one. From my first year working the front desk. A class trip to Pine Haven back in 1995. Different teacher, different students. But when I pulled the attendance sheet from the folder, I saw something that made my chest tighten. One of the chaperones listed Louis Draper. Not as a teacher. Not even as a staff member. Just a local volunteer. Age 19. I ran my finger over the name again and again as if it might change. That trip had been marked as uneventful. All students accounted for, but the line still felt sharp, out of place, because back in 1995, Mr. Draper wasn't on staff. He wasn't even known to the school board yet. Just a young man who signed up to walk kids through a trail most adults never bothered to visit. The date of that trip, May 4th, 15 years to the day before the Buttercup class vanished. I kept that folder open for hours. It sat beside my coffee, untouched, the papers inside, shifting slightly each time I breathed too close. That single name, Louis Draper, written in careful blue ink beside the words Field Volunteer, kept pulling my eye back like a weight on a string. I wasn't sure what it meant, not really. It didn't prove anything. Plenty of people volunteered back then. Pine Haven was always short on trail supervisors, but it was the date that bothered me. May 4th, 1995. 15 years to the day before the Buttercup class vanished. And Draper had never mentioned it, not in the staff meetings, not in the interviews, not once in the dozens of conversations we'd had about safety planning or route options. It felt like a door cracking open behind me in a room I thought was empty. I didn't go to the police with it, not right away. I made a copy of the form, tucked it into an envelope, and left it in my glove box. Then I started reading again. Not the old maps this time, but the newer reports, incident logs, ranger memos, interviews that had been published and then forgotten. I found one article from 2003 buried behind an ad for car wax describing a brief closure of the east section of Pine Haven due to unstable ground. No follow-up, no details. The phrase used was natural depression, a sinkhole likely, but no measurements were recorded. It was less than a mile from where Ellie Ramirez's backpack had been found. I started walking in the early mornings before the school opened. Not into the preserve itself, but along the service road that bordered the perimeter. The tree line was denser than I remembered. The deeper you looked, the more it felt like the trees shifted just slightly, like they'd grown in directions they weren't supposed to. I kept expecting to hear something. A squirrel, a branch creaking, even birdsong, but it stayed still, like everything was holding its breath. On the third day, I found a nail in the dirt. Not rusted, not old. Shiny, bent slightly at the neck like it had been pulled out of something and discarded. I brought it to the maintenance shed behind the school to compare. Our hardware stock hadn't changed in years. Same brand, same packaging. But the nail I'd found wasn't a match. The threads were finer. The head, smaller. Industrial maybe, but not standard. I didn't tell anyone. I just slipped it into a plastic bag and kept walking. The break came a few days later, not from me, but from a hiker named Robert Grant. He wasn't local, just passing through on a photography trip, according to the report. He'd gone off-path deeper than posted signage allowed, looking for fog light through the pines. Instead, he found what he described as a seam in the earth. Not a cave, not a hole, a split, hidden under moss and roots barely wide enough to see. He called it in because of the smell, something faint but wrong, like wet metal and ash. Within 24 hours, the Forest Service taped off the area. Within 48, unmarked trucks started arriving from out of state. We weren't given access, not even the sheriff's office, not fully. But I knew someone on the cleanup crew, an older man named Travis, who used to do fire line checks back in the 90s. He told me over coffee that what they found wasn't natural, not entirely. The cavity beneath the ground was carved straight lines, smooth walls, tool marks that didn't match any modern equipment. The air inside was stale, but breathable. And at the base of one corner, someone had arranged stones in a circle flattened in the center like a platform. There were markings on the walls, not symbols exactly, more like scratches made in repetition. Lines stacked over lines until the grooves sank a quarter-inch deep. They found fragments too small. Fabric pieces, a cracked button, and what looked like part of a child's lunchbox hinge. No names, nothing conclusive. But Travis said the light inside felt wrong. That's how he put it. Not dim, not dark, just wrong, as if it didn't reflect the way it should have. Word spread quickly, even without press coverage. People in town knew something had shifted. The school got quieter. Kids still came, still played, but the parents dropped them off with more hesitation. I saw one mother crying into her steering wheel before she pulled away, and every few nights someone left another pair of children's shoes outside the gate. Not new, not matching, but carefully placed, always tied, always facing the woods. A week after the cavity was found, I got a call at the front desk from a number I didn't recognize. It wasn't law enforcement. The voice on the other end was a woman, older, careful in her words. She said she used to work in intake for a private rehabilitation center in Vermont. No longer in operation. Shut down sometime in 2008. She didn't give the name, but she asked a question. Did we have any records of a man named Louis Draper applying for substitute teaching roles before 2004? I said no, that he hadn't been hired until 2006, and even then, only part-time. She went quiet. Then she said she recognized his voice from an old intake tape, that he'd been brought in briefly as a consultant for wilderness reentry work, something about nature immersion for adolescents, that he hadn't stayed long, but he'd left behind notes, diagrams, ideas that didn't sit right with her. At the time, she thought he was just overly intense. But when the story about the children surfaced, she remembered something. A sketch of a hollow tree with shoes lined around its base. Before I could ask her for more, she hung up. The number was disconnected when I tried to call back. I printed the call log and wrote the time down in my planner. No one else was in the office that day. No one else heard. That night, I went back through the school's archived newsletter submissions, the ones parents and staff sent in each month with photos, event blurbs, poetry from the kids. I found something odd in the May 2010 draft folder, an entry from Draper that never made it into print. It wasn't a lesson recap or student spotlight. It was a short paragraph about the purity of stillness and how certain environments erase the concept of time for children. At the bottom was a quote attributed to no one. The closer they get to forgetting their names, the easier it is to keep them. I don't know if anyone else ever saw it, but I kept a copy, folded it once, and slid it into the back of my daily log between the substitute schedule and the visitor badge records. The next morning, I arrived at school to find the door to Draper's storage closet ajar. It had been locked since the investigation began. But now the latch was cracked. One hinge splintered inward. Inside, everything looked untouched. Maps, rolled tight field kits, stacked neatly. Red and yellow trail markers bundled with rubber bands. Except for one thing. A folded note slipped between the first aid kits on the top shelf. On the outside, written in black ink, was a child's name I recognized. Anna Morales. And inside, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were 3 words. You're almost out. The note wasn't folded neatly. It had been crumpled and pressed flat again, like someone had changed their mind halfway through hiding it. The handwriting wasn't a child's, and it wasn't Draper's either. His was always tight mechanical, like he was afraid of wasting space. This was uneven. Some letters sharper than others. It felt rushed. The ink was black, the same kind we kept in the supply closet behind the front desk, but that didn't narrow much. We kept a dozen packs on hand. I placed it in a Ziploc and brought it to the interim lead at the sheriff's office, Detective Branson. New brought in from Hampton County after the previous team cycled out. He listened, carefully nodded, and said he'd follow up. But I knew from the way he held the bag lightly, like it might disappear, that he didn't expect it to lead anywhere. Or maybe he just didn't want to believe that a note folded into a gap between first aid kits could hold more truth than 100 pages of reports. That week, the air changed. Literally. A cold front came down from Canada, and with it the humidity that had lingered in the woods since early spring finally broke. The pines stopped dripping. The trail floors firmed up. For the first time in 2 months, you could smell dry dirt instead of wet leaves. Search teams moved farther into the preserve, this time not looking for clues. They were following a map, a stitched-together outline made from geological scans, maintenance records, and hand-drawn notes we hadn't been able to verify before. And near the eastern slope where the old mining claim had supposedly ended, they found something. Not a tunnel entrance, not a hidden room. A shape, just barely visible under the roots of a dead tree. They brought in a dig team under cover of night. No press, no public access. I watched from the edge of the access road as the first lights went up. The equipment was quiet manual tools, no machines. They weren't digging deep, just brushing, scooping, clearing a depression that had formed naturally over time but didn't match the landscape around it. By morning, they'd uncovered the top of something wooden, decayed and grooved like it had been sealed shut from the inside. A hatch, maybe. A storage lid. The boards had markings carved into them, straight lines in overlapping shapes. Not language, not decorative. More like someone trying to keep track of time without knowing how. The entire panel was removed intact and lifted onto a flatbed. What lay underneath wasn't wide. Just a shaft about the width of a man's shoulders descending in a perfect vertical drop. They lowered a camera first. The footage wasn't released. I saw it later through someone who shouldn't have shown me, and I've never forgotten it. The walls of the shaft were smooth, not dug, but worn like water had passed through over and over. But there was no water now, just air, thick, dark, and dry. The camera reached the bottom, maybe 25-30 feet, and tilted slowly across the space. It wasn't large, but it wasn't empty either. There were drawings on the walls, done in crayon, reds, blues, yellows, faint but intact. One showed a sun with arms. Another showed 10 stick figures, all with names written under them. Not all were legible, but I saw Caleb and I saw Ellie. The other shapes didn't make sense. One looked like a tree bending sideways. Another looked like a circle with legs. At the far end of the chamber there were blankets, small ones printed with cartoon frogs and stars. There was a lunchbox pink with a missing zipper, a sock. No sign of people, no sign of movement. But they'd been there. The chamber led to a tunnel, narrow and tilted, just barely tall enough to crawl. The team sent in a second camera. It traveled about 40 feet before the signal started to cut. The last thing it recorded was what looked like another handprint, small, smeared, and oddly high on the wall, as if someone had tried to reach up or maybe mark a place they passed. After that, the hole was sealed again. Not filled, just covered. Branson said they needed time to process what they'd found. He used words like containment and stabilization. I asked if the parents had been told. He didn't answer. That afternoon, I drove out to the old ranger station on the preserve's north side. It hadn't been used in years, just a shell-now roof-sagging porch slanted no glass in the windows. But I remembered Draper mentioning it once in a staff meeting, said it was too far from the trail loop to be useful. But the trail loop didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the logbook. Every group that entered the reserve had to sign in. And when I pushed open the door to the station and stepped inside, there it was still on the desk, warped and spotted from weather but legible. The last page had the entry from the Buttercup class. May 4th, 2010. 10 names. 1 teacher, 1 chaperone, 1 guide. Louis Draper. But above that faded and faint was another entry. Dated May 4th, 1995. 3 adults, 9 children. No class name, no school listed, just the initials WP under the group line. The handwriting was familiar, not Draper's, but someone else's. I flipped back 5 more pages and there it was. Again, WP. Logged the year before, same date, same vague details. I took a photo and left. I didn't call Branson. I didn't tell the school. I went home and laid the printout next to the newsletter quote I'd found in Draper's folder. I looked at the words again. The closer they get to forgetting their names, the easier it is to keep them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I stepped outside just needing air. The wind had picked up. The trees were moving in that slow way they do when the weather shifts, no sound, just sway. But in the stillness, something caught my attention. Down by the sidewalk, just past the front gate, a light flickered. I walked toward it, slow, cautious. It was a candle. Someone had lit a single candle and placed it beside a shoe, tiny pink with the laces untied. There was no note, no sound, just the candle burning steady in the windless dark. I stood there for a long time, long enough to hear a car engine start somewhere in the distance, long enough to feel the air change again. And when I finally turned to go back inside, I saw something drawn in the dust on my mailbox. 3 circles, interlocking, scratched into the metal with something dull, not deep enough to damage, but deliberate, clean. I didn't touch it. I just watched the lines until the candle burned out. Then I went inside and locked every door in my house, even the ones I never used. The next morning I called the office to say I'd be working from home. But I didn't. I drove north up toward the edge of the old preserve boundary, past the ranger station, past the new service trail. I parked near the utility road and started walking the fence line, watching the trees for anything out of place. And just past mile marker 11, tucked behind a deadfall I almost missed, I found another hatch. Smaller. Metal. No markings. And sitting on top of it, barely visible through the dirt, was a napkin. Crumpled. Water-stained. And written in a child's handwriting, crooked and shaky, were 4 words. "You're almost out west." The hatch didn't move when I touched it. I tried the edge, ran my fingers along the rim, checked for hinges, nothing. Whatever was underneath had been sealed for a long time, maybe years. The metal was coated in a thin crust of dirt and pine resin, but it hadn't rusted through, not like the old well caps or storm covers I'd seen on school grounds. This had been made to last. The napkin sat weightless on top, barely held by a twig. The ink was smeared in the corners, but the words were still there. "You're almost out west." 4 words in a child's hand. Wobbly letters like someone was writing in the dark. It was the kind of phrase you'd expect on a road trip, a parent reassuring their kid that the worst part was over. But this didn't feel like reassurance. It felt like a warning, or a message meant for someone else. I didn't report it right away. I just stood there listening. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that settles when wind dies down, but the air still hums. You start noticing things you're not supposed to, how pine needles shift without help, how the birds go silent all at once. The moment held. Then it passed. I backed away, slowly, slid the napkin into a folded envelope I kept in my jacket, and marked the spot on a survey map I'd been carrying since June. The hatch itself I left untouched. I didn't trust what was below it, and I didn't trust whoever had written that message. Because if someone was trying to help, they wouldn't have left it like that. In silence. In the dirt. Alone. The next morning, I showed the map to Branson. I left out the napkin. Just circled the location and said I thought it matched a break in the original tunnel scans. He nodded, made a note, told me he'd add it to the next drone sweep. But something in his voice had changed. He was cautious now, polite, careful, but removed. Like someone who'd been given instructions not to get too close anymore. I didn't press. Whatever I was chasing on my own now. That week, something shifted in the search logs. A new batch of documents showed up in the district server under restricted access. They weren't marked classified, but they'd been moved off the main grid just enough to keep casual eyes away. I found them through a shared archive the IT coordinator forgot to lock. It was footage, trail cams, dozens of clips from the deeper sections of Pinehaven compiled over the course of 7 weeks. Most of them were empty. A few showed deer one caught a bobcat near the creek bed. But one file 117 was different. It was dated May 17th, 2 weeks after the Buttercup class went missing. The angle was off-center like the camera had been bumped. It faced a clearing just north of the main loop, and in the middle of that frame for about 6 seconds, something moved. Not an animal. Not a person. A shape low to the ground crawling. It didn't run or stumble. It crept. And just before it passed the camera's edge, it stopped, turned, and tilted upward like it knew it was being watched. I replayed the frame 3 times. There were eyes. Human eyes. Too wide. Not blinking. I couldn't make out the rest. Hair dirt, maybe a torn sleeve, but the eyes were enough. They'd looked directly into the lens. And then vanished. I saved the clip onto a flash drive and didn't tell anyone. Not yet. That same afternoon, a call came in from a state police contact in Berkshire County. They'd found something small but strange. A leather-bound notebook, water-damaged but intact, discovered in a hollowed fence post near an old game trail on private land. It wasn't part of the preserve, but close within walking distance if someone knew the old paths. The notebook had names written inside, dozens. Some repeated, some crossed out. One page had a sketch, 3 circles interlocking, drawn over and over. On the last page, just 1 sentence. Some of them stay because they were told they had no name. The handwriting didn't match the napkin. It was neater, more deliberate, like someone who had time, or practice. Branson wouldn't confirm who had turned it in, but I saw the intake form. Anonymous drop-off, no prints, no trail camera near the post, just the notebook sealed in a freezer bag left sometime after midnight. The phrase stuck with me. Told they had no name. I thought about the newsletter quote Draper had submitted. I thought about the silence in the woods, the way the drawings in that chamber seemed less like pictures and more like memory anchors. What if they weren't just waiting to be found? What if they'd been trained not to want to leave? I started going back through older records, discipline notes, staff emails, even field trip waivers from other classes Draper had taken out. One stood out. A permission slip from 2009 signed by a mother named Evelyn Marr. Her daughter Nora had withdrawn from the school mid-year. The official reason had been relocation, but the email thread attached showed hesitation phrases like unusual behavior after the trip and confusion during pickup. The nurse's log for that day listed a single entry. Nora Maher, May 5th. Refused to speak. Kept repeating, "I'm not that name." I tried calling the number listed in her file. Disconnected. I searched property records, found nothing after 2011. No forwarding address. No current registration in the state. It was like she'd been folded out of the system entirely, like someone had pressed down on her name until it vanished. That weekend, the candles returned. Not at the school this time, but at the preserve gate. 7 of them lined on the railing, each with a drawing behind it taped to the wood, crayon on printer paper, trees, shoes, a tunnel with hands reaching up. They were taped too high for a child to place. Someone taller had done it, quietly, intentionally. And again, no footage caught them. The cameras glitched between 2:08 and 2:12 a.m. All files blank, just static. I stood at the gate the next morning and looked past the tree line, not sure what I was hoping to see. But in the stillness, I heard something. Not a voice, not an echo, just a pattern. 3 short clicks, then silence, then 3 again, like a rhythm or a code. It came from somewhere deeper in, beyond where the new maps had reached. I stayed until the sound stopped. Then I walked back to my car and sat with the engine off until my hands stopped shaking. Later that night, someone slid another envelope under the school's back door. Inside was a Polaroid blurry dark, clearly taken from a low angle. But it showed something unmistakable. A shoe. Pink, small. And behind it a pair of hands reaching up through loose boards. One hand open, one holding a bracelet. I flipped the photo over. No note, no date. Just one word written in pencil, Ellie. The photo felt warm in my hand, though I knew that wasn't possible. I'd taken it straight from the envelope, hadn't even stood under the porch light long enough for it to catch the air. But something about it, the grain of the image, the way the bracelet shone in that tiny hand, half curled as if reaching, made it feel like it had been waiting. The name on the back wasn't printed or typed, just Ellie penciled in with careful strokes like someone didn't want to press too hard. I didn't sleep that night. I left the lights on in the front room and sat by the window until morning, watching the driveway, waiting for movement that never came. I knew something was about to shift. It wasn't a feeling. It was structure. The silence had been holding for too long, and things that are meant to stay hidden only stay hidden until someone makes a mistake. Branson came by just before noon the next day. He didn't have a warrant, and he didn't ask questions, not at first. He just stood on my porch, hands tucked into the edges of his coat, and asked if I had time for a walk. I said yes. We drove in his unmarked SUV windows down No Music. He didn't say where we were going. About 10 minutes into the drive, he finally spoke. Said there had been a tip, not one of the usual ones. This one came from within. Someone on the original federal response team, now retired, had reached out with an archived map and a file reference that wasn't supposed to exist. The document itself was gone, but the code stamped on it traced back to an inventory transfer made 15 years ago. Camp gear, folding cots, ration packs. The shipping destination was Pine Haven, but not to the preserve. To a private parcel adjacent to the boundary listed under a Shell LLC with no listed contacts. The address on record led to a road that hadn't existed since the early 80s. He parked at the trailhead without a word and handed me a flashlight. The sun was out, but the canopy was thick, and once we moved past the first ridge, the light dropped. The ground felt too soft in places, the kind of soft that suggests something hollow underneath. We walked for about half a mile before we reached a break in the tree line, just wide enough to make out what had once been a structure-low stone foundation, rotted wood beams, moss growing across a splintered set of stairs that led nowhere. It wasn't a house, not even a cabin, more like a receiving site. The floor had been cleared recently. Too recently. No leaf litter. No animal signs. Branson knelt near one of the corners and brushed away a patch of dirt. Underneath was a hatch. Not metal this time. Wood. Sealed with a bolt and reinforced with lengths of chain that had been looped through eyelets in the earth itself. The lock was old, but not broken. We didn't open it right away. He called it in quietly with clipped language. I caught pieces of what he said. Structure confirmed, item intact, will maintain position. He hung up, then looked at me and said, "If we open this, we're not walking away the same." I didn't answer. I just stepped back and let him work the bolt loose. It gave without much effort. The hatch creaked not from age, but from pressure, like the air inside hadn't moved in a long time. A gust rose out of it, cold and dry, not moldy the way you'd expect from an underground space. It didn't smell like decay. It smelled like dust and oil and old cloth. The ladder descended into darkness. We went slowly, him first, then me. The drop was short, maybe 10 feet, but the ceiling inside was low, and we had to crouch. The walls weren't carved. They were lined. Planks sanded and nailed into place. Light revealed shelves along the perimeter, metal trays, empty tin cans, a row of water jugs half full, and in the center, 3 small sleeping mats. Each one still held its shape like someone had just stood up from them. There were no names, no toys, no clothes, but the walls were covered. Drawings again, stick figures, trees, suns with too many arms. But this time something else. A diagram, repeated over and over, 3 circles interlocking. In some of them, the center was shaded black. On the far side, under a shelf, we found a crate, wooden, nailed shut. Branson pried it open with his flashlight handle. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, spiral-bound lined paper, most stained or damp. The handwriting varied, but the pattern didn't. Names, dates, notes written in second person. You will eat at 6. You will rest when the music stops. You are not to use the old name. We flipped through slowly, afraid to miss something. On the second to last page of one, someone had drawn a map, not of the preserve, of something underneath it. A tunnel system, crude but labeled. Chamber, loop, gate, and at the farthest edge circled twice in red west door. That's when we heard the sound. From above. Faint, but deliberate. Metal on bark, like something brushing against the hatch frame. Branson motioned for silence, killed his flashlight. We waited in the dark breath, held unsure if we were hearing the forest or something else. Minutes passed, then a second sound, lighter this time. A shift. Wood creaking under weight. But the hatch didn't open. It never opened. When we finally climbed out, the air outside was still. Branson checked the perimeter. No prints, no disturbances. But the chain we'd unhooked was gone. Not broken. Removed. Set against the far tree stump like someone had placed it there on purpose. We didn't speak on the drive back. Later that night, I went through the box of items I'd kept since the early weeks, the napkin, the nail, the bracelet drawing. I laid them out in a row. Pieces, but not a picture. Then I opened one of the notebooks I'd been allowed to bring home. Page 4. A list of names, children's names. One of them underlined 3 times Anna M. Next to it, false recall. Correction failed. Next to another name, Ellie R., held longer, speaks in sleep. And next to a final one, J.H., no longer responding, removed. I closed the notebook. I sat with the quiet, and I waited. Around 2:15 a.m., something hit my front step. Not hard, just a light sound. I turned on the porch light, opened the door. Nothing but an envelope. Inside a photograph. Dark, blurry, but clear enough to make out the edge of a trail. A boot. And beside it, drawn in the dirt, 3 perfect circles. One of them filled in. The message underneath written in what looked like chalk. Some gates stay shut. Others are waiting. There hasn't been an arrest. Not formally. Not in the way most people picture justice. What we found in that underground room was enough to reopen files, to reassign agents, to reroute a quiet stream of attention back toward a stretch of woods most people never noticed. But there was no one left to put in cuffs, no mugshot to show on the evening news, no courtroom where someone stood up and said the names out loud. What we have are traces, a map drawn by someone who may no longer exist, a list of children with only initials, and a photograph that still makes the back of my neck tighten when I look at it, because the dirt those circles were drawn into had been dry and recently disturbed. The files were consolidated into a federal working group last I heard, and Branson was reassigned to something higher clearance. We still talk now and then, not about the case, not directly, but in the way people do when they've seen something they can't unsee. He sent me one last photo months later without a caption, just a rusted gate chained shut somewhere in the high desert. I never asked where. The families were never contacted formally. There wasn't enough to constitute official closure. But I made a choice not to wait for permission. I reached out to Ellie's mother first quietly through someone she used to work with. I didn't show her everything, just one drawing. A sun with 10 arms and a name beside it spelled out the way only a child could write. She looked at it for a long time and said, "That's her handwriting. That's how she wrote E's when she was little." Then she asked if I thought it meant her daughter had made it out. I told her I didn't know, because that was the truth. There were others I reached in small ways, sometimes a postcard, sometimes a call. Never too much, never more than they could carry. Some wanted answers, some didn't, and I learned to respect both. As for me, I still keep the napkin, the one that said, "You're almost out west." I don't know who wrote it. I don't know if it was meant as a warning or a promise or something else entirely. But I keep it in a plastic sleeve now, along with the photo, the bracelet sketch, and a folded copy of that map. I'm not waiting for resolution anymore. I'm watching for patterns. Because whatever system this was, whoever designed it, they built it not just to disappear children, but to unwrite them, to take memory itself and fold it into silence. And the only way to fight that is by remembering louder than they erased. If you've listened this far, thank you. I know these stories don't sit easy. They're not meant to. But if something in this stayed with you, if a name or a drawing or a road reminded you of something buried, don't let it go quiet. Speak it. Share it. Write it down if you have to. Because somewhere out there, a gate is still waiting to be opened, and someone might be listening for the sound.